This is Lecture 2, The Advantages of Using Latin. We will learn more Latin quotes, discuss the limitations of world building, explore ways Latin is used for storytelling, and identify 5 modes of fiction writing. Our first Latin quote is from Ovid. Cum dare non possum munera verba dabam. When I cannot give gifts, I give words. I love this quote. I hope you understand that your writing can be a gift to those around you. Words are precious, and so is seeing the world as presented through another's eyes. Write every last word in your heart. All right, let's start off our discussion with the limitations of world building. World building has gained traction in the science fiction and fantasy communities as a way to create games. RPGs, board games, and video games. Some people call world building their hobby, and they get extremely into every aspect of economics, science, philosophy, and languages. Some go so far as to compile world Bibles and spend enormous amounts of time and effort creating imaginary worlds. And there's not really anything wrong with doing this. Just be aware that there comes a point where you have done too much world building and you get less return for the investment of your time. World building should help you create your story, not distract you from actually writing it. So, another thing to keep in mind is that world building should be shaped by your medium. A person who is creating a novel should develop a world differently than someone who is creating a video game, which is an extremely visual medium and must conform to conventions of game mechanics. This course specifically explores world building in novels and conforms to the conventions of storytelling in that tradition. The father of modern fantasy, J.R.R. Tolkien, was by profession an English language professor. He worked on the Oxford English Dictionary and produced a dictionary of Middle English. So when he wrote his fantasy works, his love for words and language was an essential part of his writings because those things were an essential part of him. He famously wrote his own languages for his epic fantasy world, Middle-earth, which makes everyone else who writes epic fantasy think they have to do the same thing. However, Tolkien did this because he found it useful for his story. He was a professional linguist who deeply understood how language creates culture. When world building for a novel, I'd recommend that you have an intended purpose for the languages you use and create. Why do you need to use or create that language? If your answer is because you want to imitate someone, that's not good enough reason to include it in the story. Dig deeper. All right, lastly, I emphasize your world building only exists to serve your storytelling, not the other way around. Now, I have discovered that I am a writer who usually can't get the elements of my story off the ground unless I have a world. All my best character ideas and plot ideas happen when I get excited about how they affect a big picture world. This makes me a little bit odd, I think. So how can I say world building only exists to serve your story when I have a hard time creating a story without world building first? It's because when you write a story to serve your world building, you tell a really bad story. You can have the most awesome world with a perfectly created language and inspiring history and make it horrifically painful to read about. You all know what I'm talking about. Incomprehensible walls of text, names that are sheer gibberish, characters looking for minerals that you're not really sure why they're important, but they are for some reason, right? So all of this will serve to launch us into our next discussion, which is, why are we using Latin? Why is Latin good for my story? What does it help me do? How does it help me communicate more effectively? Now, you might find Latin is not a good for your story and doesn't help you communicate what you want to say. If that is the case, don't force it. If it doesn't work, try something different. You'll ask, well, how can I tell either way? Let's evaluate that today. All right, so imagine the amount of Latin you use in your story exists on a spectrum. On the far side here, we have Latin composition. Hence, Latin is extremely relevant to your story. It's, in fact, so relevant, you've decided to go full historical and compose it completely in Latin. It is set in Rome 85 BCE, so you are going for full historical accuracy, 100%. It has taken 25 years, but you've done it. You're claiming native Roman citizenship. What's the problem here? Nobody can read it? What? I'm offended. They published Harry Potter in Latin and The Hobbit. Why would they do that if nobody could read those? Seriously, though, I don't advise you to write your entire story in Latin unless a publisher has hired you to do this specifically, or you have a legitimate marketing plan in place, as in you're selling directly to Latin teachers for their school classrooms or something similar. On the other end of the spectrum, you're putting Latin in your novel as little Easter eggs for uber classics nerds. It doesn't really matter if the joke goes over the reader's head. The reader loses nothing, but for the people who get the joke, it's awesome. Your Latin communicates with a small niche audience, but it doesn't really mean anything to the novel. All right. So imagine this line as encased in an oval. At the ends and the extremes, you have the smallest audience and the most expertise. The closer to the center of the line you get, the bigger your possible audience. The goal as we get closer to the center of that oval is for our world building to become more accessible to the general reader. So what else can be on this line? All right. So, allusions and name etymologies. This tends to be a really common. Someone who is fantastic at this is J.K. Rowling. Most of her character names have really witty Latin etymologies, like the werewolf Remus Lupin. It's brilliant, honestly. The story of Romulus and Remus is one of the founding myths of Rome, and wolves are completely central to that legend. The classical iconography of Remus is of him sucking the teats of a she-wolf. Then Remus Lupin's last name is very similar to the Latin lupus, which is the word for wolf. So the downside of this is that people would argue that this has been overdone, and granted, it's popular to do because it's fun and it's not that hard. But you'd have to think of different ways you could spin this. Say you only use names from the Byzantine Empire and etymologies from ecclesiastical Latin. In a very similar vein, only use the name of mathematicians and Latin mathematical terms. However, I think if you pursue that, you're probably going to run into Greek as a fair warning. Romans aren't known for being mathematical theorists. They're more into the field of applied mathematics, engineering and architecture, engineering and architecture. They built on what the Greeks taught them about math. It would be fun to see allusions and etymologies entirely based on legal Latin. Honestly, Romans invented the field of jurisprudence, so we can play with that. Law is the Roman thing. Only caution, try to do this in a way that makes sense thematically to your story and feels organic. Come up for a reason why your society embraces or worships specific Latin traditions. For example, botany has a really strong Latin tradition, and your society needs knowledge of plants to survive some kind of cataclysmic event. And then continuing further down the line is a desire for historical accuracy. So you've set a story in a time and place that is where it is historically accurate for your characters to use Latin. You want to be accurate, which is an absolutely valid goal. This is one of the advantages of using Latin. It can immediately establish important details for your setting, culture, and time period which your story is set in. It makes your job as a writer easier when you use Latin in ways that clarify and answer questions the reader has about your story. Another reason why to use Latin is the most precise descriptor. Sometimes the best time to use Latin is when it is the most precise descriptor available for the moment. Words like res publica, pontifex maximus, and aqueduct are all examples of words that have been handed down directly from Latin and still hold meaning for our world today. We inherited words with a cultural heritage, and using those words can save us from writing unnecessary descriptions and explanations. All right. Some other reasons why Latin would be useful is that you want to engage with a specific literary tradition. One really extremely popular literary tradition related to Latin are the Greek and Roman myths. Novels like Percy Jackson by Rick Riordan and Lavinia by Ursula K. Le Guin are classic examples of this very popular trend. There are so many other types of literature that were composed in Latin that are ripe for retellings and reinterpretations. Christian apocalyptic literature, loads of poetry, early Christian writings about the saints and church fathers, medieval histories and myths. Shakespeare reinterpreted works from the Roman playwright Terence and retells Shakespeare's works all the time. So using Latin shows we understand these traditions and increases our ability to bring the same flair and flavor to our own stories. Another reason is to establish a mood or tone. This can easily be done with throwing some cleverly placed Latin phrases. Latin was adopted and passed down by a lot of different cultures and over centuries of time. So it keys into a lot of ideas, changes, and developments that occurred over time. Depending on where you take your Latin from, you can create a lot of different settings and tones. For example, if you want to set a very pious religious tone, you can use religious Latin with the Vulgate Bible and Latin hymns and all that. These allusions and references will make your story feel very religious and will give it a certain viewpoint. Okay, and then as we continue to move on, we also have the need to convey academic, professional, or scientific information. So Latin was the language of science in Europe for a very long time. Indeed, Latin can give you more universality than other languages when presenting information about these fields. Terms were established and passed down in a tradition of education and training for centuries. That makes Latin really useful for this purpose. Now, our last two reasons to use Latin are story-based, and they are the best reasons to use Latin in a novel. One of the goals of story is to show the knowledge and status of your character. So, for example, let's say you have a lawyer character, and he can use that knowledge of Latin as a weapon. He's run into a riffraff type character who's been bragging about how he's going to go around in the town and cause trouble. And this lawyer doesn't want to cause violence, but wants this troublemaker to know he's smart. observant person who is fully capable of pressing charges and getting him held accountable for his crimes. So he starts throwing some legal Latin in this casual conversation with this man as a warning. He has not lifted a finger, but he has managed to make this low-life character keep his mouth shut and even move on to the next town where there isn't this imposing lawyer who is throwing Latin at him and trying to stop him from causing trouble. So this interaction between two characters tells you a lot about what your character knows and values. Another reason to use Latin in your novel is that your character cannot accomplish their story goals without the knowledge or use of Latin. To make those scenes feel satisfying and believable, you'll need to establish the use of Latin in your world and to what extent your character can use it. That really is the most engaging reason to put Latin world building into your story. When you identify why Latin is a good fit for your story, you'll be able to discern what you need your Latin to do for you. When you know what your Latin needs to do, you can start to put it to work in your story. All right. And that brings us to another Latin quote to learn. Audentis fortuna iuvat by Virgil. This one's really famous from the Aeneid. Fortune favors the bold. All right. So we are going to move to part 2 of this lecture. And so I want to cover a topic to set us up for the next 5 lessons or so. As I stated before in this lecture, our goal is how to make our world building serve our novel writing. I really want to do a deep dive into that specifically. A lot of writing advice is what to do and not really how to do it. So I am going to make a very strong attempt to show you how to world build in a novel and not just tell you what to do. All right. So in order to do that, we need to review some basic writing elements of the novel. So here are 5 writing modes that are commonly used in novel writing. First, summary. Second, description. Third, scene and action. Fourth, dialogue. And fifth, thoughts and internal monologue. In ancient Roman theater, they used masks to communicate with the audience. When actors wore theater masks, they could play multiple people in one play. In addition, things like mood and gender were instantly communicated. Theater masks also helped amplify an actor's voice. Think of these modes like individual theater masks. If you understand these modes of writing and what they help you accomplish, your writing will become amplified to your audience. So we will spend the next few minutes defining these 5 modes of writing so that in later lectures we can identify where and how world building happens. Then as a writer, you can strategically choose both where and how to distribute your world building information. All right. So our first is summary. Summary is prose that narrates situations and events in a way that conveys information to move the story forward. There is a famous writing maxim to show, not tell. Well, summary is telling your reader what is happening. Despite this famous writing advice, summary is necessary to tell your story. In the next lesson, we will focus specifically on summary and how to use it to world build. All right. Second is description. Description is prose that is crafted to allow the reader to experience a story with their 5 senses. We focus a lot on description, creating a visual picture in the reader's mind, which is really important. But we shouldn't limit ourselves to only visual descriptions, but expand to include description that engages our hearing, taste, smell, and touch. Third is action. Writing action means you are narrating events that are happening in real time during the story. You are allowing the reader to experience the story as if they would if they were in the room watching it or doing it themselves. All right, the fourth is dialogue. And dialogue is the art of creating conversations between characters in your story. Dialogue is a really engaging way to bring your readers into your novel. It makes them feel like they are there with your characters and that the story is more realistic. Thoughts, internal monologue. Okay, so thoughts and internal monologue is our last and probably most definitive category. Definitive in the sense that it is unique to novel writing. All these other elements can be used in similar mediums, but novels can explore the inner psychology and workings of humanity in a way that is unique among the arts. There is no other art form that requires so much examination of human psychology, motivation, and emotion. Okay, so today we reviewed some reasons why Latin would be a good fit for your story and why it is important when writing novels to focus world building to serve the story instead of the other way around. Remember the Latin quotes for your quiz and the modes of fiction writing. Well, I'll see you next time.